We have spent $1 trillion prosecuting the drug war since Richard Nixon declared war on drugs in 1971. Another $69 billion a year down the rat hole. And what do we have to show for it? Drugs are more readily available today at lower prices and higher levels of potency than in the history of the drug war. So the longest running war in the history of the United States, armed conflict, I dare say, has been an abysmal failure.
Why do you think the war on drugs has maintained public support through so many years and so many various administrations?
Well, the war on drugs, as a phrase, was chosen by President Nixon for a good reason. When you use the phrase war, people think you can win a war. And there's victories along the way, and it was a brilliant move by Mr. Nixon to basically implement a policy which is simple prohibition. Many people know that 100 years ago you could walk into any pharmacy in America and buy any of these drugs, whether it's heroin, cocaine, marijuana. All of this was available legally, and there wasn't any such thing as a drug crime. But we learned, our grandparents learned in 1933 with the failure of alcohol prohibition, that you don't want to tell the world you're starting a new program of prohibition. So he used that war on drugs moniker and phrase to give the impression to the country that eventually we could make America drug-free. And so Americans have clung to the hope of this drug-free America that our politicians have been telling us about, because everyone wants to have their children not be in contact with these dangerous drugs, with these drug dealers. And so it sounds really good, and they've been very patient now, almost 40 years of serious drug war efforts, over $1 trillion spent. However, the good news is that now Americans understand, as President Obama said a couple of years ago, the war on drugs has been an utter failure. And the polls now backed it up to the 76th percentile. So we now believe that America is ready to hear something besides more drug war.
So let me talk about cocaine prices. This is in kilo equivalent. So in 1997, a kilo equivalent of cocaine at the farm door gate in Peru cost about $650. That's dropped to about $250 a few years ago. These numbers, by the way, all come from the UN Office for Drug Control. Then, after it gets shipped for processing to Colombia, it costs about $1,000. Then once it's imported into the United States, it costs about $15,000 now. Again, all these numbers are continually dropping over time. Once it's wholesaled in the United States, it goes up again to about $21,000. And finally, at the retail, street price of a kilo of cocaine, so once it's broken up into gram-sized packages, it goes for about $107,000. These are 2005 prices, but you can see the numbers are generally declining over time. Now, most of you may not be economists, but generally speaking, when prices are declining and demand is steady, as we had to assume it probably is for a commodity like this, that generally means that supply is increasing, right? The other thing that I'd point out that's really, really important to recognize is look at where the profit margin is highest. It's specifically at the stage of importation. Now, why is that? That is because that is where there's the most pressure on the supply chain from the narcotics regulators, the DEA. So the narcotics regulators, they think they're in the drug eradication business. They're actually in the drug regulation business. And by increasing the risk for the people who are importing the stuff in, they actually increase the ability of those who stay in the business to demand premium prices and actually raise the profit margins for the people who manage to survive in the business. So if you're able to control that part of the business by, say, corrupting a border agent, and there's been 80 border agents in the last 3 years in the U.S., just on the U.S. side of the border, that have been convicted of corruption of one sort or another, then you can make 1,400% profit margins. Now, some of you may not be business people, but almost every business person in the world would kill for a business with those kinds of margins. And in fact, these guys do.
When I joined New Jersey State Police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers. We had a 7-man narcotic unit, always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do. And then overnight, as a result of these bills, Mr. Nixon's, We went from a 7-man unit to a 76-person narcotic bureau. Well, what they decided to do was they took undercover people like myself, and they targeted us against small friendship groups, groups of young people in college, like yourselves. And as soon as we got in there and became their friends, come a Friday night, somebody would say, hey, school's out, we're off work, anyone want to get high? And of course, if nobody said that, that was our job. If somebody simply passed a marijuana cigarette to me, they became a drug dealer. That hand-held marijuana cigarette would send that person to jail for 7 years. Over 1,000 young people went to jail as a direct result of what I did out there as one undercover agent, something that I'm certainly not proud of today.
My profession is employing one police officer in 12 as a narcotics officer, for example. We have hundreds of thousands of extra prison guards being employed in order to hold the 2.3 million people in prison, more people in prison than any other country in the world, both in raw numbers and per capita.
We're seeing innocent citizens shot and killed on drug raids. We are seeing the wrong house hit on a drug raid. We are seeing high-powered weapons in the hands of untrained and therefore unskilled police officers. We're seeing scared cops who've been made to believe that, you know, that they are going after the enemy, that is the mindset, who are much more likely to engage in impulsive behavior. After my book came out, I was talking with a police chief who had read the drug chapter, and I said, okay, let me have it, because I know you're going to disagree with me. And he said, I agree with everything you're saying. I said, gosh, can I quote you? And he asked, well, what have you been smoking? And he said, no, you can't quote me. He was a new major city police chief. And I, by the way, talked to an awful lot of police chiefs and other elected officials who whisper their support for the legalization approach, but who are, for a variety of reasons, most of which are obvious, reluctant or fearful to speak out.
In the last 40 years, since we started the war on drugs in 1970, we have spent well over $1 trillion of our tax dollars on this war on drugs, and today we spend $70 billion minimum every year we continue it. And what do we have to show for that money? We've made more than 39 million arrests in the United States alone for nonviolent drug offenders. We've done everything we can do to destroy their lives, put as many in jail as we can possibly do, which is a lot. We now have 2.3 million people in prison in the United States for all offenses, not just drugs. 500,000 of them are there for nonviolent drug offenses.
Now,
and despite all this, Judge, despite all this money so ill-spent, all these lives crippled, today drugs are cheaper, they're more potent, and they're far easier for our children to access than they were in 1970 when I started buying them as an undercover officer.
We're really talking about the people's laws. And if we're not satisfied with the laws that our federal government is enforcing, then we really need to take a look at what our responsibility is. Why have we let this go so long?